GOTH by Otsuichi. Chapter 1, GOTH. It had been about 3 weeks since I last saw Moreno. It was summer vacation, but we had to attend school that day. She arrived well before homeroom began and immediately threaded her way through the classroom bustle over to my desk. We had never bothered with greetings. Moreno stopped in front of me, pulled out a notebook from her pocket, and placed it on my desk. I had never seen it before. It was small enough to rest on my palm, with a cover of brown synthetic leather, the kind of thing you see all the time at stationery stores. "I found it," she said. "It isn't mine." "I know." She seemed to be enjoying this. I picked up the notebook, feeling the smooth fake leather against my skin. I flipped through it, skimming the contents. The first half of it was filled with tiny writing, and the latter half was blank. "Read from the beginning." I did as she said, moving my eyes along the letters by an unknown hand. There were a lot of paragraphs. It was almost like an itemized list. May 10th, it said. Met a girl named Kasuda Mitsu in front of the station. She was 16. I spoke to her, and she got in my car shortly after. I took her to T Mountain. As she gazed out the window, she told me her mother was obsessed with the letters to the editor column in the newspaper. I stopped the car at the top of T Mountain. I took the bag out containing knives, nails, etc. from the trunk, and she laughed, asking what was inside. The notebook went on like that. I had seen the name Kasuda Mitsu before. 3 months before, a family had been hiking on T Mountain, a married couple and their son. The father had not had a day off in a long time and had laid down to rest when they reached the mountain. The boy had tried to get his father to play, but the man had not budged. So after lunch, the boy went to explore the woods alone. The mother realized her son was missing. Then she heard a scream from the forest. The couple went into the woods and they found their son. He was standing still, looking at something just above his eye line. When the parents followed his gaze, they saw some reddish-black dirt on the trunk of the tree and something small and sinister nailed to it at eye level. They gazed around them, and all the trees nearby had something nailed to them. Bits of Kasuda Mitsu. Someone had taken her body apart in the forest. Her eyes, tongue, ears, thumbs, organs, each was nailed to a tree. One tree had, from top to bottom, the left big toe, the upper lip, the nose, and the stomach. Another had other bits of her arranged like Christmas tree decorations. The murder was soon the talk of the nation. The notebook Moreno had found contained a detailed description of how Kasuda Mitsu had been killed, which bits of her were nailed to which tree, and what kind of nails had been used, but it contained no mention of the writer's emotions. I had been following the case on TV, in the papers and in the magazines, on the internet, so I knew a lot about it. But this notebook contained minute details that none of those reports had revealed. I believe this notebook belonged to the man who killed her. Kasuda Mitsu was a high school student from the next prefecture over. She had last been seen saying goodbye to her friends in front of the station, and she was only the first victim in the gruesome murders that had all caused a stir across Japan. There had been another case with strong similarities, and it was believed to be the work of a serial killer. He wrote about the second victim, too. June 21st, I spoke to a woman waiting for the bus with some shopping bags on her arm. She said her name was Nakanishi Kasumi. I suggested I give her a lift home. On the way to H Mountain, she noticed we were headed away from her home and she began to make noise. I stopped the car and hit her with a hammer until she was quiet. I placed her in a small hut on H Mountain. The nation had learned the name of vocational school student Nakanishi Kasumi a month earlier. The news and papers had snatched it up instantly, and I had known there was a second victim before I even got home from school that day. She had been found in a small hut on H Mountain. The building had been left abandoned for some time, its owner a mystery. It had been badly damaged by rain and was filled with mold and stains. It was about 10 feet wide, and the walls and floor were just planks. An old man who had come up the mountain to collect food noticed that the door of the hut, which had always been closed, was now open. Surprised, he came closer and noticed the stench. He looked inside. It seemed certain that he could not tell what he regarded at first. Nakanishi Kasumi was laid out in rows on the floor of the hut. Like the first victim, her body had been cut into pieces, and these had been placed carefully within 10 by 10 grid on the floor, each bit about 10 centimeters away from the next. She had been turned into 100 small lumps. The notebook described the process in detail. There were no witnesses to either case, and the person who had killed them had not been arrested. The media were still talking about the 2 murders, calling them the gruesome work of a serial killer. I like watching the news about this case. Why? It's a strange case, Moreno said. I had been watching for the same reason, so I understood what she was trying to say. People had been killed, torn to pieces. People who had done that to them, and people who had done that actually existed. Moreno and I had a unique interest in this kind of awful event. We were always looking for stories that were so tragic they made you want to hang yourself. We had never spoken about this strange inclination directly, but we both sensed it in the other without saying anything. I imagine normal people would have been appalled. Our sense of these things was abnormal, so whenever we discussed torture implements or methods of execution, we always kept our voices low. When I looked up from the notebook, Moreno was staring out the window. I could tell she was imagining all Nakanishi Kasumi's parts laid out on the floor. "Where did you find this?" I asked, and she explained. Yesterday evening, she had been sitting in a coffee shop she liked, a dark, quiet place with a shopmaster who never spoke. As she drank the coffee he'd made, she flipped through the pages of cruel tales of the world. She heard the sound of rain, and when she glanced out the window, she saw it coming down really hard. A few customers had begun getting ready to leave, but Moreno saw them sitting down again. They must have decided to wait out the evening showers. There were 5 customers there, not including herself. She stood up to go to the bathroom. As she walked, she felt something strange underfoot. She had stepped on a notebook lying there on the shop's floor, which was made of black and wooden planks. She picked up the notebook and put it in her pocket, apparently never once considering trying to figure out to whom it belonged. When she got back from the bathroom, the other customers were watching it rain. No one had left. She could tell just how hard it was raining from looking at the shopmaster, who had ducked outside for a minute and then come back in, soaking wet. Moreno forgot about the notebook and went back to her book. When it stopped raining, the sun came out again. Several customers stood up and left. The rays of the sun soon dried the roads. It wasn't until Moreno arrived home that she remembered the notebook and began to read it. I went to the bathroom twice. The first time, the notebook wasn't there. It began raining immediately afterward, trapping the customers there. When I stood up again, the notebook was laying there. The killer was in that shop. The killer lives near here. She clasped her hands in front of her chest. The 2 bodies had been found 2 or 3 hours away from where we lived, so it was not impossible for the killer to live there, but it didn't feel real. This case would be talked about for years. It was still unsolved, but the sheer gruesomeness of it was enough to make that clear. Everyone in the country was talking about it. Even children knew about it. It was too famous, making it hard to believe that the killer was really that close. There's a chance this is only what the writer imagined, based on the news. "Read more," said Moreno, confident. August 5th. I gave a ride to a girl named Mizuguchi Nanami. I met her in a soba shop near S Mountain. We went to the shrine in the woods on the south side of the mountain. She went into the woods with me. In the woods, the notebook's owner stabbed Mizuguchi Nanami in the stomach with a knife. In the notebook, the killer broke down her body. In cramped handwriting, he described how he had gouged out her eyes and what color the inside of her womb had been. He had left Mizuguchi Nanami in the woods. "Have you ever heard the name Mizuguchi Nanami?" Moreno asked. I shook my head. There had not yet been any reports of her corpse being discovered. Part 2. I became aware of Moreno when second year began and we found ourselves in the same class. At first, I thought she was like me, living her life without getting involved with anyone around her. Even during break periods or when she was walking through the halls, she always avoided people, never joining the herd. We were the only 2 people like that in our class. That is not to say that I gazed coldly at my classmates' excitement the way she did, though. I would answer if someone spoke to me, and I joked around enough to keep things friendly. I did the bare minimum to lead a normal life. But these all were surface relationships, and the smiles I produced were lies. The first time we spoke, Moreno saw right through that part of me. "Will you teach me how to smile like that?" she'd said, staring directly in front of me after school, no expression on her face. She must have scorned me for it privately. That was at the end of May. Since then, we had begun to speak occasionally. Moreno only ever wore black clothes, dark colors from her long straight black hair to the tips of her shoes. In contrast to that, her skin was paler than anyone else's I'd ever seen. Her hands were like ceramic. There was a small mole under her left eye, like the patterns on a clown's face, and it gave her a slightly magical aura. Her expression changed significantly less than that of most people, but it did change. For example, when she was reading a book about a serial killer who had murdered 52 women and children in Russia, Marina was clearly enjoying herself. It was not the same as the suicidally gloomy look she wore when she was in a crowd of our classmates. No, her eyes were glittering. When talking to Marino was the only time I didn't feign my expressions. If I'd been speaking to anyone else, they would wonder why my face was so blank, why I never flashed a smile. But when I was speaking to her, none of that mattered. I imagine she chose to speak to me for much the same reason. Neither of us liked to attract attention. We lived quiet lives in the shadow of our livelier classmates. And then came summer vacation and the notebook. The day after she showed me the notebook, we met at the station and boarded the train for S Mountain. We'd never met outside of school, so it was the first time I'd ever seen Moreno out of uniform. She was still wearing dark colors, nevertheless. So was I, and from her expression, she noticed. The train was quiet and deserted. We didn't talk, keeping our noses in our books. She was reading a book about child abuse, and I was reading a book written by the family of a famous child criminal. When we dismounted, we asked an old woman in a decrepit tobacco shop near the station how many soba shops were near S Mountain. We learned that there was only one, and it was not far from where we were. It was then that Moreno said something very poignant. Tobacco kills a lot of people, but cigarette vending machines are killing that woman by stealing her job. She didn't particularly seem to be looking for a clever response, so I let it pass. We walked along the side of the road toward the soba shop. The road led uphill, curving along the slope of the mountain. The soba shop was at the base of S Mountain, in a row of bars and restaurants. It was not at all crowded, with few cars or people around. There were no cars in the soba shop's parking lot at all. But apparently it wasn't closed. The sign said open, so we went in. The killer met Mizuguchi Nanami here, Moreno said, looking around the shop, as if we were in a popular tourist spot. Pardon me, but that's still just a possibility. May have met her here. We're here to determine whether that's true. I ignored her and read the notebook, which was written in blue ballpoint pen. The story of the third woman's death was not the only other thing in the book. There were a number of other mountain names as well. They were on the first page before the accounts of the murders. There were marks in front of the mountain names: double circle, circle, triangle, and X. The mountains where the three bodies had been found were all marked with the double circle, so this was probably a list of which mountains looked good for killing. There was nothing that could identify who had written it, and neither of us considered giving it to the police. They'd catch him eventually without our doing anything. If we gave them the notebook, they might arrest him faster, and there might be fewer victims, so it probably should have been our duty to warn. But, sadly, neither of us had the kind of conscience that was bothered by keeping that kind of thing to ourselves. We were cruel, reptilian high school kids. If a fourth victim were found, then it would be like we killed her. How awful. That's all we said while we slurped up our soba. Moreno didn't seem to think that was especially awful. Her tone was disinterested, all of her attention focused on the soba in front of her. We asked the shop owner for directions to the shrine. Moreno kept her eyes on the notebook as we walked, stroking the cover with her fingers, touching it where the killer had touched it. Judging from that gesture, she had a fair amount of reverence for the killer. I had a trace of that myself. I knew that was hardly appropriate. The killer was someone who deserved to be punished. He should not be looked at in the way that you would a revolutionary or an artist. But at the same time, I knew some unusual people worshipped famous murderers, and I knew that becoming like them was a bad thing. We were captivated by the horror of what the notebook's owner had done, though. The killer had stepped over the line of ordinary life to destroy people physically, trampling their identity and dignity. As if caught inside a nightmare, we could not look away.